Welcome to Panel 1. Panel 1 will focus on threats and challenges that online stakeholders face. We'll look at issues of cybersecurity, surveillance, and privacy, and how these affect online users, free speech, and human rights. I'd like each panelist to introduce themselves and the work that they do and the most pressing freedom of expression challenge that they see facing online stakeholders.
So I'm Meg Roggensack. I'm the Senior Advisor for Business and Human Rights at Human Rights First. And for almost 20 years, we've been working with businesses to address the human rights impacts of their global business operations. And we do this in a variety of ways. We work through voluntary multi-stakeholder initiatives, such as a Fair Labor Association, the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and a newly established initiative which addresses the responsibilities of private security contractors, as well as the Global Network Initiative, which you'll hear more about today. David Sullivan is here with us, and Cynthia Wong and others in the room are involved with that. But all of these initiatives revolve around the notion that there are governance gaps that are not going to be filled in the near term. And so stakeholders come together from government, business, civil society, academia, and the investor community to identify the human rights principles and then translate those into a set of expectations and benchmarks for businesses to use. And the other key piece of that is an expectation around both company implementation of those expectations and then some external assessment. And I think that is, for us at Human Rights First, sort of the biggest challenge in this space. We recognize that this is a new industry and that in many ways the challenges that the information and communications technology sector faces are novel and difficult. But the process for addressing them really is no different than the one that I've outlined for the other industries that we work with. And I think our expectation would be that businesses need to take a more active role in both identifying the threats to freedom of expression and privacy online and addressing them in a more systematic, thorough way that is transparent and credible. We'll be talking more about that today, I know.
Well done. So my name is Chris Soghoian. I'm a privacy and security researcher based in Washington, D.C. I'm supported by the Open Society Foundations right now, and I generally try and get companies to be better about privacy. I also try and get the government to be better, but that's a much tougher job. So the greatest threat right now to our privacy, our security, and many other things, actually the greatest threat to the internet is in fact the copyright lobby. So for decades, the copyright lobby has been the 800-pound gorilla here in Washington, D.C. Whatever they've wanted, they've gotten. Their issues are largely bipartisan, even though Hollywood traditionally hasn't given that much money to the Republicans. Both parties have gone along with whatever Hollywood has asked for. Copyright has been extended repeatedly. This is the term of copyright. We've had truly heinous laws passed, like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, that makes it a felony to create technology that would allow a consumer to fast forward through the previews on a DVD, to make personal copies of DVDs, to unlock or jailbreak cell phones, and that kind of thing. And the copyright lobby has really used its power in a fairly crazy way. So they get what they want, and they force these laws down our throats, and they impact our entire economy, right? So Hollywood and the record companies are a very, very small portion of our economy, and they're responsible for very, very few jobs compared to the electronics industry, compared to startups and internet companies in Silicon Valley. But they've been here a lot longer, and they have this wow factor, right? So if the CEO of Google or Facebook visits the Hill, it's actually tough in some cases to get meetings. But when a famous musician or a famous Hollywood actor comes to the Hill, everyone is out in the hallways wanting to meet them and shake hands. And this star factor leads to a better reception for those industries. The reason I say that Hollywood is a threat is because in an attempt to protect their own failing and sinking business model, they're willing to take the internet down with it. We saw in the last few weeks the very public and vocal fight against SOPA, but this is only really one example in which the internet has been able to push back. Usually Hollywood gets what they want. or gets what it wants. And so we have threats to things like anonymity. There are systems out there, some of which the State Department is funding, that would allow dissidents and activists and journalists around the world to anonymously communicate, share information without fear of, of any kind of actions by government actors. But these systems can also be used to engage in unauthorized file sharing. There's no way to build any kind of anonymity system that cannot be used by file sharers, by other criminals, or actually by criminals, because I don't think file sharing is truly a crime, but also by journalists. And so Hollywood has decided that their needs come first. They have pushed to get rid of anonymity systems. In the most recent SOPA bill, there was a provision that would make it a crime to develop technology that would get around the circumvention or the takedown efforts that they have pushed. And I mean, at the end of the day, one of the other big things that they've pushed for is legislation that would cut off people's internet access. I truly think that internet access is a human right at this point. You cannot engage in our society without connectivity, but Hollywood thinks that if you have, in a few instances demonstrated disregard for their law, for their copyright, that your connectivity should be taken away. We've seen this White House engage in backroom negotiations with both Hollywood and the cable companies and internet companies to agree to 6 strikes and you're out, voluntary takedown rules or voluntary internet connectivity termination rules. So, there are many bad things that are on the horizon, and Hollywood is pushing them. In many cases, they're using other language to get there. But I do think we need to be careful because they have a lot more power, even though they are actually quite small. Thanks.
I'm David Sullivan, Policy and Communications Director at the Global Network Initiative, which I joined in September of this past year, doubling the size of our staff. GNI is it's a multi-stakeholder initiative, which is a particularly unwieldy piece of jargon that I think describes a really important concept in this space, which is that the collective efforts of technology companies and other stakeholders, human rights organizations, press freedom organizations, socially responsible investors, and academic institutions can have an impact on corporate responsibility and accountability in the internet that would be greater than the sum of those parts. What that means is that the technology companies and investors and civil society groups in GNI have a jointly agreed upon set of principles that Meg mentioned that were hammered out over the course of a couple of years of extensive negotiations rooted in international human rights standards on how technology companies can responsibly and accountably help to support freedom of expression and privacy online and across the technology sector. Also, the companies that are members of GNI commit to undergoing independent assessments of how they are complying with those principles and implementation guidelines. And the 3 founding companies of GNI, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, have just had their first independent assessments completed and will be reporting out on those later this year. In terms of threats to freedom of expression online, I want to focus on perhaps not the most dire of threats in terms of places where you have authoritarian, oppressive regimes, the Irans and Syrias of the world, or some of the threats that are closest to home in form of SOPA and the copyright debate, which we'll talk a lot about today. But on some of those places out there where there's still potential, I think, for a better path to be chosen, but where there are emerging threats to free expression. And looking at places like India, where I'm sure people have read in the news about some of the controversy there about the government pressing tech companies to proactively monitor the content that users place on their sites, or places like Thailand, where holding intermediaries, conduits for information online, responsible for the content that users are putting up there, are taking on very worrisome dimensions. And those are some of the places where GNI, the coalition of tech companies, human rights groups, and others, are looking to try to engage on policy and try to make a change for the better in the future. Thanks.
Hi everyone, my name is Ashkan Soltani. I'm an independent researcher and consultant here in DC. In past lives, I was a technologist at the Federal Trade Commission, and I also work with the Wall Street Journal as a researcher for the What They Know series, which is a look into online privacy issues. So I think we've covered a lot of the challenges here, the spread of challenges. And one of the challenges I'd like to talk about is the challenges for policymakers as they approach how to tackle these new technologies, right? So oftentimes as we talk about the copyright issues, the cybersecurity issues, which hasn't really come up, or the human rights issues, and how they function in terms of technology, we're talking about fundamentally the same technology, right? So we're talking about things like DNS and routers and computer networking equipment that we all don't need to know about, but they all function fundamentally to do different things, right? So the same equipment that effectively protects systems from cyber attacks or from virus outbreaks, are often the same systems that monitor networks to prevent the distribution of copyrighted material, and as are the same systems that kind of prevent speech, monitor speech, surveil people, or block communications, right? So we're talking about, say DNS and these routers and these packet inspection devices. And so the challenges are, how do we come up with a framework that can help kind of prevent the bad uses of these technologies, authoritative regimes that we don't kind of agree with, or censorship of speech, or monitoring surveillance, while promoting, say, cybersecurity, promoting safety of devices, these kind of things. And so there's been a lot of efforts to kind of come up with bills. There's GOFA and there's all these approaches, but at the end of the day, we're talking about literally your Linksys router at the home. At the end of the day, your little Wi-Fi router that you use at home, that has a kind of a blacklist feature for adult content, right? So depending on how you structure regulation, you're actually talking about the regulation of a home Wi-Fi router. And I'm not sure we want to go down that road, but we want to come up with ways where technology companies in the States, like we've seen Blue Code and some others, sell technology overseas that are used specifically for censorship and surveillance. So I'd like to kind of try to ground it in a little bit of a technical approach of what we're talking about here, and maybe see if there are ways to come up with policy that can address these issues without kind of throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you. I know one issue that many people are interested in is Facebook's IPO. How does Facebook going public affect users, and what should investors be looking out for?
So, Mera, I think you've hit on a really interesting point, which is that the IPO offers everybody an opportunity to look more closely at some of the assumptions around not only the existing model, but the projected growth of Facebook. Because as everybody recognizes, they'll be growing into markets with policies that are at best problematic and at worst openly repressive. So we believe strongly that these are questions that investors should be asking, because they affect how one views the market capitalization of Facebook. They've made assumptions about these markets, and those assumptions presumably are based upon what level of business they are able to conduct in these markets. So we think, right off the top, there's a good, solid economic argument about what are your projections based on, and what does that mean in terms of the assumptions about how you will go into markets and what type of service you will be able to offer in those markets, and if challenged, what types of policies you will have in place to address those challenges, and where you think you're going to come out there. More broadly, we think that there's still a role for greater transparency. Right before the IPO, Facebook reached a settlement agreement with the Federal Trade Commission about its privacy policies that in the main really revolved around the fact that the policies were not remotely clear, and that users really had to be rocket scientists to figure out how to engage on changes to the policy. It's just very complex. And they've made a number of changes. They're to be applauded for that. But regrettably, this all took place in a context that is not really very open or public. We don't know what ultimately many of the findings were that the FTC reached in looking at this. And the FTC has also called on Facebook to conduct independent assessments going forward. But the order itself leaves quite vague, how that will be carried out, how these changes will be implemented and monitored. And so we think there's room there for not only investors but users to be taking the opportunity of this IPO to be asking much more specific questions of Facebook about these types of policies and changes to their policies. One really sort of fundamental piece of this that I think needs clarification, not just for Facebook but for other companies, is they draw a distinction between the information that users provide and the information that they collect. And the information that users provide is sort of clearly articulated in their policies and spelled out. The information they collect, far less so. And we do think that that's an area of, where users, and as has been true around the world, there are people litigating over this, there needs to be a lot more clarity about that second category than is currently available.
So the most fascinating thing for me reading the Facebook IPO statement was that Facebook makes less than $5 per user per year, which means that our data is harvested and analyzed by the company. We are tracked everywhere we go on the web, everywhere there's a like button present, even if we don't click it. This information is mined. Advertisers are allowed to target us, down to the employer that you work for, the sports that you're interested in. I mean, you can target 25 people in Washington D.C. with a Facebook ad. All of this information is manipulated and kept, which can also benefit divorce lawyers and other civil litigants and the FBI and state and local law enforcement agencies for $5 a year. Now we hear that free services power the internet, advertising-supported services power the internet, and consumers want free services. But I pay for my phone bill. I pay for my internet access. I pay for postage stamps. And at this point, Facebook basically is the new email for many consumers. I also pay $50 a year for my email. Facebook has become an essential communications tool, and consumers don't have the opportunity to pay for Facebook. If consumers could pay just $10 a year, the company would double its profits, and it could do away with all these shady practices that it currently engages in. But unfortunately, Facebook doesn't give consumers a choice. There's no way to pay for Facebook Pro, for the sketchy free experience. And I think that Facebook should offer this. Now they won't, because fundamentally they're in the business of tracking consumers, and they think that as time goes on, they'll be able to make even more than $5, maybe 10 or 20 or 30 or 40. And they think that this is the path that will bring them extreme wealth. But I think it is time for companies to give consumers a choice. I understand that many consumers are going to want free services, and I understand that the price of zero, has an almost intoxicating effect, right? It weakens the mind and makes us do things that are so stupid that you would never understand why people do it, right? So think about all the people who spend hours out in front of an ice cream store once a year when they have free cone day, right? People who get paid 20 bucks an hour and are willing to spend 2 hours in line. But I think it is time to ask why these services don't give us the opportunity to pay for the great tools and services they provide, right? And I think this idea of take it or leave it, either we data mine you and violate your privacy, or you go use some other crappy service that none of your friends are using. I think this is a false choice that we need to do away with.
I just have, I think, 2 points on this particular issue. One is that if looking at the Facebook situation, you can see how much the international expansion is driving their business strategy, and the vulnerabilities and risks that's going to increase for them in the future. So the kinds of issues we're talking about today, these are only going to increase in magnitude and scope. And given that situation, I think especially in a situation where companies do not have clear and transparent policies about how they're incorporating human rights considerations around free expression and privacy into their operations, it's important that you have a more transparent process. Otherwise, essentially, companies are asking people simply to trust them, and I think that only gets you so far.
So two different kind of points on this issue as well. So one, I encourage folks to actually look at this, and this is biased because I worked on the case, but the actual complaint is pretty strong and pretty broad-reaching, even though the settlement may not be. The Facebook FTC complaint has a lot of kind of nuggets in there about potential business models and potential implications of things like, I saw Mera tweeted about the Facebook deletion and retention of photos issue. There's a lot of nuggets in there that should pan out well, I think, if people pay close attention. But in terms of the human rights angle, I think there's two. One, there's the censorship side, right? And so the censorship of speech or limitation of access to Facebook. And in terms of the implications of the IPO, as we see Facebook move internationally, we're going to see them do as many others have and self-censor. So we talked about networking equipment and all this kind of tools that governments can use to censor speech. We're also finding that companies are proactively self-censoring. We saw censoring. We saw Twitter recently announced that they're going to do a country-by-country censorship, which some argue is kind of a good play because it's not a global censorship, but it is still kind of proactive self-censorship in order to operate in those markets. And we're going to see that Facebook and others engage in these practices as they expand. And the question, I think, as Danny pointed out, comes to transparency and knowledge that what data is being censored and what the policy and what the kind of the guidelines of what is and is not accepted will be for these companies. So that's going to be one of the challenges. The other challenge is as Facebook grows, so right now all the advertising that happens on Facebook is on Facebook.com, right? So you have apps and you have everything happening on the domain. And while there's some amount of data that kind of third-party companies can get about you through your open graph, such as when you go to what's called an instant personalization site, which is like a company like Yelp. If you go to Yelp, it will pull your information from Facebook, like who your friends are, and customize that content for you on Yelp. There's only a handful of partners that can do this currently, but as Facebook begins to expand, we're going to find that, like Google, in order to compete with Google, they will have to take their ad network to third-party sites. That means they will need to advertise on sites like New York Times, right? And unlike Google, where their advertising network is currently different from their profiling information, so your Google Plus profile information is not used in their advertising and their double-click ad network. So when you go to the New York Times, your ads aren't based on your Plus profile. Facebook will likely do this, right? So that means when you go to third-party sites like the New York Times or Washington Post, they will know specifically who you are, what your interests are, and what your social network activity is, and target you based on that in terms of ad networks. Now, this third-party data sharing will open up. In order to enable this, you have to enable third-party data sharing, which will open up a whole host of issues with regards to leakage of information about you on your social network to third parties, as well as anyone sitting in the middle of those communications, such as government. So if I'm in Iran and I go and browse the New York Times, assuming I can actually view the New York Times, even if Facebook is HTTPS secure, it's encrypted, and it protects some of your data, those data flows are now going to flow to the New York Times and open up things like your age, your location, your comments, these kind of things to anyone on the wire, so the government's there, as well as the New York Times. And I think that third-party data sharing as the result of expansion of Facebook to ad network across the web is going to be a big issue.
Okay, well, how do the panelists feel about Twitter's country-by-country censorship? How will that impact users around the globe? And also, what's the ideal way for Twitter and Facebook to deal with government takedown requests?
The challenge that Twitter faces is a common one to all companies in this sector. And some of the policies that they announced to address this are important. They talked about the fact that they will require a legal notice, and that they will evaluate that. They'll try to be transparent, except where prohibited by local law. And that they will try to evaluate going forward and make information available outside of those jurisdictions. But for us, it really comes down to, kind of a fundamental question. Is that really enough? Is that really the best that a company can do? And I think our view is we don't think so. That when Secretary Clinton made her landmark speech 2 years ago, she talked about what's really at stake here. And what she said was, we're either going to have one global internet where everybody has access to the same information and it doesn't depend upon where you live or the quality of your government, or we're going to have a balkanized internet with exactly that situation where some people have access to very limited information, other people have access to a lot of information. And so the question that the latest Twitter incident poses is, how do we prevent that? And in Secretary Clinton's speech, she talked about the fact that the internet will be what we make of it, and that we all have a proactive, affirmative obligation to fight back against these restrictions and to try to preserve the openness of the internet. As David mentioned, there are some jurisdictions where the choice is pretty stark. There are an awful lot of jurisdictions that are really in the middle, that are trying to get it right most of the time and that are struggling with that. And we think that companies have a real obligation to try to fight these challenges diligently, and to do that, they need a clear policy about that, a clear policy that is embedded, really, we think, in the principles of the Global Network Initiative around what companies can do, and being transparent about that, being transparent about how exactly they're going to identify requests that implicate freedom of expression and privacy, what steps they're willing to take, and how far they're prepared to go to challenge these limitations. It's often said that companies are in the middle. There is no middle here. You're either on the side of an open internet, or you're enabling censorship and repression. And we do think that that's really the choice. And we'd like to see companies taking more affirmative steps to try to help realize that vision of an open internet. We know it's not easy. We know there are roles that other players can play here as well. But in the absence at the moment of any clearer governmental consensus, companies are in a position, really, we think, to make clearer what their policies are and to then act vigorously upon them.
So, with respect to my colleague next to me, I think it's about time to stop quoting Hillary Clinton's speech on internet freedom, because the last 2 years have really shown that those were shallow, empty words. Right? Our government has seized tens of thousands of websites in that time. They've sort of shot first and asked questions later, as demonstrated by the recent forcible seizure of mega upload servers, leaving thousands of users' innocent files captured by the government, potentially to be deleted in the next couple of weeks. Right? This government has not demonstrated any respect for internet freedom. And if you look at the Internet Freedom Bill that's working its way through the House, it requires that the State Department come up with a list of countries that don't respect internet freedom. If the State Department were being honest, we would be #1 on that list. We are not a country that respects internet freedom. In just the last year or two, we've had cell phone networks shut down in San Francisco by the police without any kind of judicial order. We routinely have secret requests made to internet service providers on behalf of law enforcement investigations. Even more than a year after the fact, we still don't have any official confirmation that Google and Sonic received the request as part of the WikiLeaks investigation. Now, the Wall Street Journal published information about it through leaks, but the court records still contain no information. The copies of the 2703D orders that the ISPs allegedly obtained still haven't been made public. This is not a free country when it comes to internet connectivity. Now, with regard to the issue of Twitter's new censorship policy, I obviously think that any censorship is a bad idea, but Twitter's policy doesn't concern me too much. And the reason is that as Twitter seeks to expand, it has to play by the local rules in a country. So Twitter basically has two options, right? Option one is to only be in California, and option two is to open offices abroad and play by their rules. This is what Google has done. This is what Yahoo has done. You can, if you're a Yahoo user and you go to the Yahoo search engine in Argentina, for a long time, if you search for Diego Maradona, the country's most famous soccer player, you got 0 search results because Diego was upset that the internet contained lots of pages detailing his philandering and drug abuse. And so rather than face the fact, he just got a judge in the country to issue an order to Yahoo taking down all of those results. It's ridiculous, but these are the rules that companies have to play with. I think that the more important thing we should be talking about with regard to Twitter and Google and Yahoo and these other companies is what can they do to protect their customers. And censorship isn't my biggest concern because censorship is something that you can see. Right? Particularly when these companies design their systems in such a way that they tell you, sorry, there are more results that could be found, but we're not allowed to show them to you because of this local order. The thing that bothers me more than censorship is surveillance, because surveillance is covert. The NSA doesn't send you a letter in the mail to tell you that they've been listening to your phone calls. And all of our internet companies, the Twitters, the Googles, the Microsofts, they all routinely receive requests from law enforcement agencies. Sprint has 110 employees doing nothing but responding to surveillance requests. And so as we talk about Twitter, I think the thing to think about there is what has Twitter done to protect its users in the face of requests from law enforcement agencies? Well, last year, Twitter got a lot of press after it published, or after it notified the 3 individuals associated with WikiLeaks that it had received a request for their information. That's great. Companies are not required to tell their users. So Twitter went beyond the bare minimum in notifying its users so that they could attempt to fight that request. And they've actually lost, and Twitter has, I think, handed over the data. But what's more important than telling users is not keeping data in the first place. Right? So Twitter's lawyer, who actually represents Google and Facebook and T-Mobile and Sprint, Al-Ghadari, says if you build it, they will come. If you retain data, law enforcement will come and ask for it. And Twitter continues to log data about users, even after it received a request as part of the WikiLeaks investigation, even after it's received 2 requests associated with users in the Occupy protests from Massachusetts and New York police agencies. Right? Twitter doesn't need to keep this data. But like many internet companies, it thinks that it can squeeze a few pennies of value out of these logs. Doesn't really know how it's going to do it, but it thinks at some point, some smart scientist somewhere will come up with an algorithm that will allow the company to make a few bucks on its data. And so it retains this data and basically weighing out the pros and cons. And the pro is that Twitter makes some money, and the con is that the government, either our government or the French or the Spanish or the Chinese government, gets this data. And the responsible thing for companies to do is to keep as little as possible. And that should be what we should be focusing on. And unfortunately, all of the big companies, including all the members of GNI, are hopelessly failing.
I'm going to pick up on a couple themes here. One is the importance of leading by example. And for both governments and for companies that state that they believe in a free and open internet and in protecting the rights of their users, the implicit messages that their actions send reverberate louder than words. And so there's a real, I think, crucial pressing need for both governments and companies to lead by example. And I think the other panelists have mentioned a couple things in that regard. I think when it comes to... Sure. I don't know if my microphone is working. On the case of Twitter, I would just recommend Cynthia Wong from CDT had a good blog post looking at how Twitter's policy compares with the GNI principles. But I would also say that beyond companies responding narrowly, as we put it, to government requests for information, making sure that they're strictly based on the law, not overbroad, et cetera. There's also, the importance of companies working proactively to push for greater disclosure, both by themselves and by governments, of information about these kinds of requests. And I think, looking at the example of the surge of interest around the copyright issue and the SOPA and PIPA legislation, it would be interesting to see some of these companies really put their resources to use to push for greater transparency about requests from law information, both on the part of their own policies, but also on the part of governments.
David, can you talk a bit about the GNI principles and how the companies, can you state who the companies are who are part of GNI and how they're responding to human rights elements as part of that? And are they taking voluntary action to protect their users through GNI?
Sure. So GNI has now 5 company members. We have the founding companies, Google, Microsoft, and Yahoo, and we've also in the past year added 2 new companies. One is a startup called Evoca, and the other is WebSense. And so I think what we're trying to do is see how the GNI principles, which really provide guidance on how companies should respond to requests from governments that can infringe upon free expression or privacy, can be applied not just in the specific case of the large, massive US internet companies, but looking at other companies across the sort of technology sector. So those are some of the things that we're looking at right now. I think one of the key aspects of the GNI principles that it's important to understand is that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach. There are no easy answers to these issues. I think Ashkan sort of really put the nail on that in terms of talking about how many of the technologies that we're talking about can be used for different purposes. There's often difficult trade-offs that companies face in terms of whether to withdraw from a market or how their actions can impact the rights of their users. The key elements of the GNI principles that I would just draw attention to is one is making sure that companies are treating these issues with the gravity they deserve in their operations. Is the board of directors regularly informed and thinking about and taking decisions on these issues, or are they delegated down? Are companies, as they're looking at particularly important decisions about entering markets or introducing new products, are they fully thinking through the human rights implications of those decisions?
Do folks know what WebSense does? They're one of these companies that provide networking equipment that can be used to, again, protect you from spam, or a lot of governments have. Our government runs a similar product by Blue Coat to prevent you from browsing porn at work or something. But they also can be used to censor speech. And so WebSense, I think what's interesting about them, unlike Google and Yahoo and these guys, are trying to use this as a marketing or kind of differentiating play between Blue Coat to say we're different. I think that's a good step. I think what would be ideal is if companies would. So what often happens is a company gets approached by a government to sell equipment to that government, and that usually comes along with a bunch of geeks of the company going to that government and helping them configure the nuances of the technology, right? And so what would be, I think, some sort of audit process or monitoring process or proactive step that companies can take that sell this equipment while they kind of engage and monitor the use of this equipment. Another example is Blue Coat, the company in Syria, we were able to show that Blue Coat had knowledge of these products pulling updates. So the software would connect back to Blue Coat servers and get software updates and rule updates from Blue Coat. And these companies these servers were located in Syria, and these companies had knowledge of these updates. So that's another thing whereby companies could proactively monitor the usage of their equipment through inspecting logs, talking to their sales engineers, etc., to be more proactive about the distribution of this equipment abroad. I think that would be a good addition to that step.
I think it's also important to remember who isn't a member of the GNI. Right? So let's assume that what GNI is doing is a good thing, that the companies are actually changing in substantive ways. Well, Facebook isn't a member of the Global Network Initiative. Arguably they should be, right? They collect a lot more private information. They are certainly getting requests from law enforcement agencies. The telephone companies, which play probably the most important role in facilitating government surveillance, are nowhere to be seen, right? AT&T, which facilitated the NSA's warrantless wiretapping of millions of phone calls and telephone records. Verizon, which allegedly gave the FBI backdoor access to its communications backbone. Vodafone, which provided the Egyptian government with the location and names of activists who participated in food riots. These companies are nowhere to be seen. right? And so it's great that the Googles and the Microsofts of the world are participating, and arguably Yahoo probably had good reason to join up after the CEO was called a moral pygmy during a congressional hearing. But we need the sketchy companies to be joining too. We need the companies that are actively facilitating surveillance, and the companies who've built their entire business models around enabling government surveillance. Right? So Google and Yahoo are susceptible to consumer pressure. They have products that they provide to consumers. But the SS8s of the world, the Blue Coats, the NICEs, the Verents, these are surveillance vendors that sell products only to government agencies. There's no way to have a boycott of Verent or NICE or SS8. Right? I can't go down to Office Depot and not buy their product. Right? They're only sold to the police and to spies. And these companies don't care. I mean, if they cared about human rights, they wouldn't be selling these products to begin with. So at the end of the day, the GNI model is only going to go so far. It's only going to really apply to the consumer-facing companies. But the other ones, they need to be dealt with in some way, and really they need to be regulated. We need to regulate them out of existence.
So I wanted to pick up on two different arguments. So just to elaborate on what David has said, I think one of the things that's starting to happen is that particularly both the press and the Congress are asking more questions about what companies say about their policies and responses to these questions. And that's a good thing, because even taking the company's statements at face value, it's important that there be some way to actually verify that what they say they're doing is actually happening and that it's meaningful. And as I've tried to convey in the discussion this morning, it really takes work to translate these statements into actual policies, durable policies that have an impact on the ground in real time. One can't sort of innovate on the fly. We know that when that happens, the internet becomes less open for all of us everywhere around the globe. And certainly the GNI is a really important tool for doing that. And we wish a lot more companies were involved in, and I think it's really actually a principle and a process that's open to any company. I agree with you, Chris, that it's far harder to get the companies in that are not consumer facing, but we have done it in other sectors, and we're confident we can do it here. We need folks like you to bring the kind of pressure that will make that happen. But I think the other thing is that it's also true that all companies need to be taking affirmative, proactive steps. David outlined, some of the items that those steps would include. Strong policies supported by senior management, but integrated in the way that, for example, anti-corruption and anti-discrimination policies are integrated throughout the company. This isn't just sort of something that can be siloed over here on the side. It has to be fully part of the overall company culture and embedded from the top all the way down to the employee on the ground on the receiving end of these requests. And as he's indicated, there has to be some process for decision-making and accountability around how those requests get handled, and some transparency to the public about what of it. What did they learn from that? How did they handle that? Where are they going with that? And then ultimately, shareholder engagement of the type that the GNI is promoting, because ultimately, these policies are affecting the most vulnerable among us, who depend on the internet to realize the rights that a lot of us in this room are taking for granted. And so it's just vitally important. I think to the point Chris made about the equipment suppliers, we wrote a blog a couple of weeks ago, Excuses, about the kinds of excuses that these companies offered. One of the most frustrating aspects is that trying to regulate around this problem would be challenging, because there are aspects of this technology that activists are using or that are being used to help circumvent restrictions. So we do think that there is a role there, certainly for regulation, but there's also an increasingly important role for companies. And I liked some of the points, Ashkan, that you were making about what technology can do to better identify in real time how these products are being used or abused, and how to correct that. And I'd be interested in more thoughts along those lines. I think this is an area that needs further development. What are some strategies that companies could start to develop to know when their products are being abused, and perhaps take steps to address that? And is there more that could be done?
Can I ask you a quick question?
Sure.
So you described the importance of the GNI type role of bringing these issues to the boardroom and making sure that upper management knows what's going on and they're in the loop. And I guess my question is, what do you do when hostility to privacy is coming from the CEO down? Right. So Facebook has built its entire business model around abusing people's privacy. Mark Zuckerberg seems to have this philosophy that he knows what is best for all of us, and that is to make sure our information is as open as possible and as accessible to as many people as possible. What do you do when the company treats its users like chattel and doesn't respect their data? And this isn't just a rogue engineer somewhere, but this is coming from the top down.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, we've asked Facebook on the record to respond to a number of questions. Because of the IPO, it's a little tough. They're in the silent period. Some questions that are forward-looking can't be answered. But we also think that given the number of regulatory proceedings around the globe, 6 or 7, relating to privacy policy, there needs to be more sunlight about the implications of those findings for Facebook's policies going forward. They've now committed in multiple jurisdictions to make changes to their policies, and there should be some ongoing affirmative oversight by the regulators to ensure that those commitments are met, but also we think a role for those that are concerned about it to play both in Congress and then in civil society. There needs to be more transparency around the expectations and the Facebook's efforts to deliver on those commitments.
Have companies been responsive to when you talk about the human rights implications of their technologies, and how can civil society put more pressure to make sure that human rights are respected?
In terms of surveillance
technology? In terms of the
technology?
conversations that you've had with companies about the human rights principles in GNI and how they can respect human rights, have companies been responsive, and how do you think we can take it one step further where those ideals are really implemented?
So I think there is a mix, as the dialogue today reflects. Some companies have been regrettably on the front lines, as Yahoo was many years ago, in turning over information on a user that landed him in jail, and as was indicated, being singled out by Tom Lantos as a moral, CEO called a moral pygmy. It doesn't get much worse than that. But I think what we're calling for is a greater degree of scrutiny on the part of all of us in this room, on the part of congressional committees and leaders who are starting to take a more active role, and even where the regulators are overseeing that in following through, but also with the press. Don't just take these statements at face value. Ask what they can point to show that they're actually doing what they say they're doing. The GNI, we think, is a valuable tool because it commits companies on the record to a set of principles, set of benchmarks, an assessment process, and a reporting process to the public. So we think that process is an important process. We've seen it work in other industries, but it does take a tremendous degree of work and time and effort. And I think we recognize that the decisions that companies make affect all of us. And there's, as I think one person on this panel put it, there's no opting out of the internet. So opting out is not a choice. We have to have policies that do better than that are rights effectuating rather than rights limiting. And so I think what's good about this dialogue and some of the related conversations in the context of the IPO or Twitter censorship or the development is there's an emerging public consensus about not only the choices companies are making, but the expectations that we as users have about companies and whether what companies are doing is really sufficient to address our expectations.
But after Yahoo disclosed information on the identities of these Chinese activists, and they were arrested and I think maybe even tortured by the Chinese government, so Yahoo paid some blood money to the victims' families, and they set up this scholarship fund at Georgetown to bring one person a year there, I think, and they joined GNI, they helped to create GNI, but Yahoo hasn't actually changed its privacy practices in any substantive way. Right, so every Yahoo user, every Yahoo Mail user, when you send a message, you send an email to anyone else, Yahoo voluntarily appends your IP address to the outgoing headers of every email. So this sounds sort of technical, but what it means is that any recipient of an email can find out which computer sent the email to them. If you're a Google Mail user and you send a message to someone, the recipient can only find out where you were if they get a subpoena and go to Google. In designing the system in this way, Yahoo has been able to engineer themselves out of the process in most cases of law enforcement requests. Right? The police don't need to go to Yahoo and say, tell us which IP address sent this email. It's attached to every email message. This keeps the number of requests they get down. And this also means that they're not going to be in this nasty situation where they're forced to hand over data to some government, right? The only person who gets the request now is the local internet company who is providing dial-up or DSL service to the Yahoo user. Similarly, if you're using a wireless internet connection with your laptop and you're logged into Yahoo or Facebook or Hotmail, and you're sending your private information back and forth between these services, anyone else in the room using a commonly available tool, the most widely known of which is called Firesheep, can hack into your account, steal your information. This is because these services do not use SSL encryption, the lock icon that you see when you go to your bank or your health insurance company. Google has been doing this by default for all Gmail users since January of 2010 and had it available as an opt-in option since Gmail launched. Now, last year, after the Tunisian government started actively hacking Facebook users' accounts, Facebook turned on SSL by default for people in Tunisia. But if your government hasn't demonstrated that it's actively hacking your accounts, then Facebook doesn't give you default protection. So consumers in the US are still vulnerable. Anyone who's in here who's not listening to me and who's actually browsing Facebook, I could hack into your account from my phone because the company has decided to put your privacy second. Right? It costs a bit more money to get enough servers to run this SSL stuff by default. But Yahoo still doesn't even offer this as an option. Right? And what this means is that the kind of deep packet inspection equipment that Ashkan was talking about can easily collect Yahoo Mail users' information. All the emails that go back and forth between Nigerian Yahoo users can be grabbed by the government without the government even making a request to Yahoo. And again, this means that Yahoo receives far fewer requests from companies or from the governments, and it means that they don't find themselves in a situation where governments are threatening to block them. They don't need to. They want people to use Yahoo because every email sent over Yahoo can be monitored by the government. So we need to ask ourselves, are the commitments to G&I process enough, or do we need these companies to actually implement substantive security protections? They haven't done it up until now. We've seen senior FTC officials, outgoing FTC Commissioner Harbour 2 years ago called on every cloud computing company to deploy SSL by default. And Yahoo and Microsoft still haven't done it. Facebook still hasn't done it by default. And it's time that they stepped up.
Well, so, and I think you kind of, both of you highlighted one of the key issues around incentives. We're talking about a small, we're kind of talking about a gray area in terms of selling equipment or, and expanding market share or taking on the cost of additional security features. It's not like we're asking the CEO of these companies are considering sending their kids to school in Tunisia or they're going to be in Tunisia. They're trying to decide if they want to have business in these countries. And there's probably not enough kind of either press cost, public cost or regulatory cost for these companies to consider these issues. And so the idea is how can we as a group of people try to incentivize companies to do some of these things, like keep information for less time, add additional security features that would cost them, or consider some of the implications of expanding business, since their current incentives are to expand market share and to sell a product, and they will agree to based on the rules of the place. They're not, like I said, they're not sending their kids there. They're just selling software.
Yeah.
Right?
We just to say that absent that external pressure, you're only going to get so much results. So we need much greater public scrutiny of the practices of these companies, and then whether that's considering. I mean, I think there's been a significant change in the past year on these specific issues. Things like what's been in the press in the Wall Street Journal and Bloomberg, particularly on the export of surveillance technology, greater scrutiny towards the internet companies, and we've now started to see regulatory and legislative proposals here in the United States, in Europe. Those things need to be considered much more vigorously, and with that kind of pressure in other industries, whether it's oil, gas, and mining, or in apparel, and now with the addition of Apple joining the Fair Labor Association, the supply chains for electronics hardware, consumer electronics products, there tends to be progress towards greater transparency and accountability. It doesn't always work that way, but if you don't have that kind of public pressure, you're not going to get that kind of progress.
Great. Well, I think we should open up the floor to attendee questions. And so, Christiane will have the mic. We'd like to take press questions first, and please state your name and affiliation. And before you leave, if you could please, we have release forms on the tables. So if it's okay with you and you'd like to sign that, please do. So if we have any questions from the press first. Okay. Do we have any questions? Okay.
Favorite colors?
Okay, I'll keep going then. Yes, Marvin.
Chris, you mentioned some sketchy. Marvin Amore. Chris, you mentioned some sketchy Facebook tactics about privacy. Can you go into some detail?
Sure. So Facebook has. So the question was, what are Facebook's top 10 sketchiest privacy activities? Facebook has, I think, uniquely developed this tactic, and in fact sent a really, really bad message to Silicon Valley in doing so. That what they do is they push things to the breaking point in the area of privacy, and then they wait and see if there's any backlash. And every once in a while there's a bit of backlash, and then they take like 2 or 3 tiny steps backwards, and then they beg forgiveness, but they've already gone like 10 steps forward. And they do this over and over again, and they basically, do it and beg forgiveness later. And in this case, we see with the recent FTC investigation that, full disclosure, both Ashkan and I worked on at various points when we were at the FTC, Facebook got its wrist slapped a little bit, but given the obscene amount of wealth that Facebook has now in terms of user data that it's been able to obtain by forcing things open and forcing the collection of more data on more sites, I think that it was the cost of doing business. Right? Facebook has shown that it's better to just plow forward, ignore your users' privacy, change their privacy settings, and when people complain or when regulators investigate, just deal with it as it comes. And I haven't really seen any company be as brazen with regard to its tactics and its systematic abuse of privacy as Facebook.
Right, so who remembers Beacon? Does anyone remember Facebook Beacon?
You may want to explain what it was.
So Facebook Beacon was this thing whereby, this feature of the Facebook website whereby when you go to a site like, I believe Blockbuster was one, Ticketmaster, basically any third-party site that was participating in Beacon, and I think there was like 50 or 60 at the time, and you purchased something, or you saw a movie, or you bought a ring for your fiance or something, they would that site, so Blockbuster or whoever, would notify Facebook of this activity and put it in your newsfeed. This was in 2009, I believe. So Chris would go watch a movie, and I'd get a notification that says, Chris watched, Chris watched some fun movie, and it would appear in my newsfeed. So people freaked out. This was like huge kind of pushback, huge outroar. There was a lawsuit based on VPPA against Blockbuster for this. There was a bunch of class action lawsuits. They completely stopped doing this, right? So forward to 2012, we now have this feature called frictionless sharing, which isn't Beacon, but in fact, when you go to third-party sites like Spotify and a bunch of, I can't remember all the sites, I think Yelp does it again as well, a bunch of other sites. When you take activities on a travel advisor, when you purchase a ticket, those sites will send Facebook a notification of your activity, and it will appear in your newsfeed, which is pretty much Beacon. But we're now in 2012, and people don't seem to be that surprised by it. And so in these kind of shady practices, or these 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of thing, we're actually seeing the same issues come up over and over again. So that's another example.
I think also, yes, Cynthia. Okay, sure.
Hey, Cynthia Wong with the Center for Democracy and Technology. I'm wondering if you guys could comment a little more on the proposed export control measures in the current version of the Global Online Freedom Act. which is that I think a lot of people are pushing for more kinds of controls on the export of technology that can be used for surveillance, but there's also this issue of dual use where the same technologies can be used for a wide range of other internet activities.
So yeah, one of the challenges I think in GOFA are that to address some of these dual-use technologies, they're focusing on sale to governments, right? So one of the hooks for GOFA is that you must be selling this equipment to government entities. And there's a lot of good research out there from Georgia Tech and Berkeley, and I'm actually doing some as well, showing that it's actually not governments purchasing these equipment, right? So in China, a lot of the censorship for the Great Firewall in China, in fact, isn't state-run. It's actually ISPs in China kind of interpreting what they think the Chinese law should be and configuring their equipment to do those things, like block Falun Gong. And there's different practices by ISP, but the ISPs are the ones purchasing and enabling these equipment, and that wouldn't hook on GOFA, right? And I think part of the challenge is, as was described, it's about the use of the technology, not the actual technology. So how do you regulate the technology? And so maybe you regulate the use. And I don't have great ideas for that beyond Cindy's know your customer approach, or some of what the GNI has talked about, which is like proactively try to figure out what the hell is going on with the equipment you sell and what people are doing, and if it's a problem.
I would just add the challenge of the current version of GOFA building on the U.S. government determining a list of internet restricting countries, and then both the problems of politicization that could result from that, but also you have a lot of countries out there where there's questionable practices going on that may not be designated to be internet restricting, and then you lose those. And the legislation would not cover that. So that's another area that I think needs to be addressed. And that, I think that you may need a combination of factors, including the kinds of know your customer approaches that have been proposed in concert with other regulatory means.
Yes, so there's two things that I'd like to criticize about this bill. So the first is that the tie is to internet restricting countries. So a government that merely surveils its citizens and then arrests people in the middle of the night based on things they've posted on Facebook would not be an internet restricting country. You would have the right to post things to Facebook and the right to be arrested and tortured, but they just would deal with you once you posted that material. So I think the hook there is wrong. The other big problem right now is this growing and vague term of dual-use technology. So originally, this term meant things like routers, right? So Cisco sells routers that carry packets and include the ability to do some kind of filtering in some cases. So your school or your university or your employer has a Cisco router powering their internet connection. Every bit that goes through your internet connection is going through a Cisco router, or one made by a similar company. And those routers can block malware, and they can block spyware, and they can block phishing attacks, and they can also block the New York Times, right? So that's a dual-use technology under the sort of term that people were using a couple of years ago. And what's happened is slowly everyone is throwing other things into this term of dual use. And the most disgusting recent example was actually by Phil Verveer, the State Department ambassador, I guess, for internet freedom, or whatever his official title is, at an event at the museum last year, in which he claimed that lawful interception was a legitimate dual use. So this means that if the Iranian government wants to, if the Iranian police, because in Iran there are crimes just like in every other country, if the Iranian police want to covertly track someone, then a GPS tracking device sold to the Iranian police is a dual-use technology. If the Iranian police want to investigate a criminal who's using encryption, then selling a weaponized zero-day security flaw that can insert spyware onto someone's computer, well, that's a dual-use technology. And once you include lawful interception technology into the category of dual use, then everything is a dual use. There is not a single surveillance technology that cannot be used by law enforcement agencies. The only real question then is it being used with a warrant, or is it not being used with a warrant? And that is truly a legal question, not a question of the capability of the technology. And I think this trend of the State Department to throw in this term lawful interception into the definition of dual use is really troubling, because what it effectively means is that no surveillance technology is off limits. And what we're then saying is, well, you know, the standard for lawful access in India, that's not good enough, so we're not going to export technology there. But the Bahraini courts, well, they've shown a commitment to human rights, although they haven't, so we're going to export stuff there. And what this really ends up being is that those countries that, with whom we have cozy relations are okay, and they get the technology to oppress and monitor their citizens, and those that are not on our friendly list don't. Right? And I think this can be seen with the recent export, the continued export of tear gas to Egypt. Right? I mean, who in their right mind would export tear gas to this government as they're using it against their people, you know, in the streets? But this is for lawful purposes. There are protests and riots, and well, the police have to do something to control the chaos. We cannot allow this term to envelope and to take over everything. There's nothing left that isn't dual use now. And I think, given what the State Department has been doing, I think we really need to reevaluate this bill, because otherwise it won't stop anything.
So, Cynthia, I think you raise a great question, and I think in our view, the challenges around regulating this technology are apparent from the discussion and from our discussions elsewhere. So there's a limit to what regulation can do. There needs to be better regulation, but we do think that in the main, a better response would be found in the earlier title of the bill, which would require companies in this sector to do exactly what other internet service providers, other companies are required to do, namely have a policy in place that includes human rights impact assessments and due diligence. So they identify the risk, have a policy to address that risk, and then ongoing affirmative steps, ideally including strategies to either technologically disable, to stop service, to stop updates. So some kind of plan in place so that when they're doing the ongoing monitoring of this product, things go wrong, they have an ability to do that. We took a look at the companies that have been implicated in these illegal hardware sales, and with the exception of Hewlett-Packard, none of them had a policy. In fact, one of them said, well, we rely on the expertise of the government agencies to tell us, and we're like, wait a minute, that's completely wacky. So their thinking is so far from what we're discussing that that would be an enormous advance. And it's often said, well, many of these are small companies, but if that's the case, and if they're selling through resellers or the like, they could get together, as we do in the GNI, and together collectively elaborate a policy that will work for them together. We know that when resellers put these contracts together, ultimately, the service contracts flow directly between the ultimate purchaser and the original provider. So there's no surprise there, but ultimately, how these services are being provided and how they're being maintained. There are some relationships there, and if there are relationships, then there should be some affirmative effort to establish what the risks are and a plan to address them.
I wanted to add one more thing, which is that in some cases, we are paying for the surveillance technologies in other countries. Right? So the best example of this is Colombia, where US anti-drug efforts have financed hundreds of millions of dollars of surveillance equipment that have been used by the secret police there, that are being used to spy on journalists and activists, who then get, of course, arrested and tortured. Right? You know, this isn't a case of, oh, look at these companies who are sneaking stuff out of the country without telling anyone. We have the bills. We're paying for these things. This is something that our government is participating in and encouraging because, well, these are U.S. companies that are exporting their technology, and these are jobs. I think we really need to also hold the State Department and the Defense Department and the DEA accountable when we are exporting this technology abroad as part of our foreign policy.
It's a great point. And I think when we were talking about the sort of the shady side of the industry, the non-consumer facing companies that we as individuals can't go and boycott and not buy their technology at Best Buy, the US government is a significant consumer of all of these. I think the Wall Street Journal published today the attendee lists from the surveillance industry conferences, and the number of U.S. Agencies ranging from federal to local is really striking. And I think that opens up, there's a leverage point for citizens to engage the government, to engage with the companies that they're doing business with.
If I could pick up on that. So one thing that we've asked is whether or not there are federal, state, and local procurement policies in place to address this. When they're dealing with these companies, do they ask these questions? And of course they don't. They should. And whether it's required by law or not, there is an avenue here, I think, to start to ask these questions, both journalists and members of Congress and the like. They don't have policies in place, and ultimately it would be nice if these got hardened into actual procurement guidelines. But in the absence of that, it would be useful if at least that were an element in the question around qualifying contractors.
And part of it is actually to talk about budgets. Part of it has a lot to do with all this kind of homeland security money that's going to small towns that, like Officer Bob in Denver or in some suburb of Colorado, is buying as much technology as he can find to spend his budget from the Homeland Security grants. And so, in addition to like 8-wheel tanks, that these bunker busting kind of tank kind of devices, they also buy technology. They buy like any IMSI catcher and surveillance device they can get their hands on, which then promotes this rich ecosystem of surveillance technology. So companies that were previously trying to figure out their business model of building tools to help filter content for child porn or for schools not browsing safe content are like, actually we can use that same technology and sell it to these guys who have these huge budgets, and an industry grows.
Yeah, it's worth remembering that a few years ago, the Chinese government tried to force all of the PC manufacturers in the country to install internet filtering technology on their devices, and the technology they used was actually a pirated copy of a US manufactured safe school internet connection suite, right? So this was something that schools would install on their networks to block people from looking at porn, and the Chinese just took that software and substituted a different blacklist. Right? Instead of blocking porn sites, they blocked, pro-democracy Falun Gong websites instead. This technology can be used by all sides.
Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up panel one. Thank you to the panelists. Thank you for the attendees' questions, and fascinating discussion. Thank you so much.